Diet enim nixasa hiwis timina ilknich laloitza kina at titwatisa. Thank you so much. Good evening, friends and relatives. I offer gratitude to Creator for bringing us together in a good way. I told you that my name in my Indigenous language is the storyteller. In English, I am called Tai Simpson. I hold the identities of being both Black and Indigenous in my language, Nimipu Timtki. I told you that I am a citizen of the Nimipu Nation, otherwise known as the Nez Perce tribe in the language of our colonizers. I also told you that I am a descendant of Chief Redheart, as well as a long line of powerful matriarchs. I often feel a great deal of pain and grief and outrage across my identities. We all know and understand that systemic racism was the engine that built this country on stolen land, and that racism to this day acutely affects Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. I often feel joy and love and abundance across my identities as well. How blessed am I that I carry both matriarchal wisdom and Black girl magic. My existence across identities is an act of political defiance. I am the living, breathing, and deeply powerful culmination of my ancestors' prayers. I believe that Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty are deeply interconnected, and I hope that our time this evening proves to be a reflection of our shared struggles, our shared blessings, and our shared knowledge. And let our time this evening be empowered by the Indigenous ancestors on whose land we each occupy. Tonight, I am broadcasting from the unceded territory of the Niwa and Numu people, commonly known as the Shoshone, Paiute, Bannock, and Yakama nations. What we know as Idaho occupies the territory of the Shitsumush, Coeur d'Alene Nation, the Nimipu, the Nez Perce Nation, and the Kootenai people. And I also want to name that UCSD is on the homelands of the Kumeyaay people. Please excuse me if I mispronounce that. And I am deeply grateful for the invitation to join you all for this event. My preferred pronouns are she and hers. And I would also like to take a moment before I move into some reflections on land acknowledgements that today is also the National Day of Trans Resilience, if I have that correct, and please excuse me if I have that wrong, but I'm doing my best to be mindful in recognizing and honoring our shared experiences across communities and identities, which includes recognition of the experience of my trans relatives in our social movement space. Thank you, Transgender Day of Remembrance. I really appreciate that. So while you're sitting with me this evening, please take a breath in honor of those whose lives have been lost, in honor of those who continue to struggle in our fight towards collective liberation. Take a moment of silence for those who continue to face acute hardship as they, seek humanity. And I'm thinking specifically of the trans community in Idaho. For those of you who don't know, last legislative session, we had several pieces of legislation that were very bigoted and clearly anti-trans. So we have a lot of work to do, both in Idaho and my community, and then across the nation. So I hope that we can all take a moment for reflection for the Transgender Day of Remembrance. So thank you for that. These days, like when I join a space, I tend to do my best to honor ancestors and descendants. These days, I like to offer a little bit more than just land acknowledgements as well. Land acknowledgements are a powerful introduction at many events. But they're often delivered by descendants of colonizers. They're progressive and they give warm, fuzzy feelings to white folks. But the acknowledgement is an actual recognition of the dispossession of our homelands. Settler colonialism is this ongoing process and a system of power that perpetuates the loss of land by Indigenous people. So land acknowledgements are not the end of a conversation on settler colonialism, but the beginning. At the end of the day, land acknowledgements would be unnecessary if we had our land back. And I'll say that one more time. Land acknowledgements are unnecessary if Indigenous people were returned to their rightful place as stewards and caretakers of our homelands. And many of us have been keepers of the land to the tune of about 15,000 years. So I just wanted to make that note as part of our time together as well. Part of my work, let's go into that's who I am, but what I do. I work for the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence, and I work to interrupt and mitigate violence in Native American communities. I am honored to serve 3 of the 5 Indigenous nations in Idaho that are federally recognized. That language is also perpetuates white supremacy. So I want to be careful when I use that language about federal recognition. There are several nations, probably close to a dozen, that have and can claim ancestral territory in Idaho, and I get to work with a handful of those. Um, Addressing violence in Native American communities is inextricably connected to the systems of oppression and racism in this country, which is why a part of my work is also anti-racism education. And y'all, let me tell you, there is not enough money in the world to sufficiently compensate folks who are actively engaged in transformative justice work, anti-oppression work, or anti-racism education. Like, this is literally tireless work. I deliver this work and I deliver this education in Idaho. Idaho is predominantly white. It's like 90% white here. It's a common known fact that white nationalists are elected as political officials. It is a common fact that law enforcement officers are also white nationalists, and the number of perpetrators of violence are in fact law enforcement officers in Idaho. So it's not only the work towards collective liberation and towards a world without violence, but it's also actively dismantling these systems that continue to oppress and marginalize our people. As an organizer in the community, I co-founded and am the co-director of the Indigenous Idaho Alliance, and it's a much-needed organization here. The Alliance is part of the resistance against oppressive political and social systems that adversely affect Indigenous nations, both in Idaho and in our neighboring states. Our work encompasses missing and murdered Indigenous women's response and education, community care and mutual aid, policy advocacy, and consultation. That consultation involves presentations to the Idaho Indian Affairs Committee as part of the Idaho legislature. We act as somewhat of an ambassador, an ambassador system that connects tribes in some meetings as well, moving from one tribe to the next to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And then, of course, cultural resources for non-natives who are doing their best to learn about whose land that they occupy, and then the culture that comes with that. I told you in my Indigenous language a little bit ago that my name is the storyteller. The stories that I carry are not my own. They are passed from generation to generation. The old stories belong to my ancestors, and my stories created in my lifetime belong to my descendants. And the way that each of us lives our lives is the story that we're each writing for our future. Storytelling is not only my name, but it's my cultural and spiritual practice. Storytelling is my love language. I use contemporary and traditional oral storytelling primarily to champion decolonization, futurism, healing, and liberation. And my time with you this evening isn't so much about the stories that I share, but I do hope that you leave with a set of tools and openness to sharing your own stories, especially if you share identities of Blackness and Indigenousness as well. I'm going to pause there. I think somebody tried to chat me for something. Let me see. All of you, however, so the question was about visibility. I love that all of you are here. I would love it if each of you participated in the way that was comfortable for you, whether it's videos off or on, whether it's muted or not. If you have a question, please go ahead and drop that in a chat, and I'll do my best to keep track of those as we move along. I'm not here to lecture you. I'm here, like I said, as a storyteller, and my understanding of this event at one point in time was an open mic space. And so let's continue that vibe. If you have a story that resonates with something that I'm saying, let's share it, and then we can make space for that. I'm more than willing. Let's see. So my life as a Black and Indigenous woman is rather complicated, but at the same time, it's filled with so much joy and so much brilliance. I don't feel like I ever get to rest, but that's a common thread for a lot of, I hear that primarily for Black women, but I also see it with some of my grandmas and my matriarchs that just stay grinding well into their 60s and early 70s. It is constant work for me to honor my ancestors. It's constant work to dismantle the bullshit that we're seeing in contemporary political and social arenas. And it's constant work to live in a way that imagines the most radically inclusive, empowered, abundant, and joyful future for my descendants. And what I'm saying about that, like futurism, especially as a Black and Indigenous woman, is really difficult. Because I can't, like, in the face of Black lives being lost at the hands of police with impunity, the sheer amount of missing and murdered Indigenous women across the country makes imagining a future of thriving and abundance for us very, very difficult. And I also want to acknowledge in that there's so much history between Black and Indigenous communities that's parallel. They are mutually inclusive, not exclusive. And I'll dig a little bit more deeper into that as we move along this evening. So many, many of you, I'm sure, are aware of how much our communities have sacrificed to uphold white supremacy, right? The way that some of us engage with our blood quantum, right? Like, what does that mean to really hold on to how much Native we are, when in fact the only creatures within the United States and in some other countries that have pedigree are dogs, horses, and Native American people. So really let that resonate for a moment. Like, why and how do you hold on to this blood quantum system? And do you understand the parallels between that blood quantum system and the systemic annihilation of Indigenous people? You are Indigenous because you are connected to the land in a very powerful way. And you are Indigenous because you have a language that represents what the land is saying. And I'll say that again for you. The reason why I started my time with you this evening in my language, because it's an homage to the ancestors, but my Indigenous language was a gift to my people from the land. And if we think about it that way, whether you speak 1 word, 2 words, 20 or 2,000 words of your language, your ancestors hear you and the land hears you, right? So that's a really important thing I would also love for you to take away this evening. Let me go back to the point about how much our communities have sacrificed to uphold white supremacy. Blood quantum was one example of that, but gentrification that we're seeing in a contemporary context. Gentrification is colonization, y'all. Like, whether gentrification is about building a skyrise, like who is adversely affected by that displacement? And what do we know is displacement? Colonization, the theft of land. It creates food deserts. It creates education deserts. It creates healthcare deserts. And the parallel for Indigenous communities is that reservations are prisons, all caps, full stop, right? There was no way that reservations were this plush land meant for us to thrive while white people took over the rest of our ancestral homeland. No, they gave us land that was unfarmable. They gave us land that was incredibly remote. We have an Indigenous reservation up here, the Duck Valley Indian Reservation, home to the Numu people, the Shoshone Paiute families, and they are 3 hours from everywhere in any direction, and their reservation borders crosses both the Idaho and Nevada border. By design, it is not an easy drive to get out there. It's desolate, seemingly desolate. But here's what white folks didn't know, and I really enjoy this, and I'm going to crack a joke. It's Indigenous people, we always know how to survive on the land, right? We are of the land, we are from the land, born of the land, right? So no matter where we are on our ancestral homeland, we're going to thrive and we're going to survive. And I saw somebody on Facebook crack a joke about, the potential catastrophe of COVID-19 and then, the zombie apocalypse that's also imminent. And it was like a Indigenous ancestral, like, elder wisdom, where they're like, we're not going to show white people how to survive again because that didn't go well the first time, right? Like, because it didn't. Like, we showed them how to survive, and then what happened? So we're not going to do that again. Everybody get on that team. Some of the stories that I want to, like, illustrate, like, my identities and how they intersect and how there is conflict, because there is very, very real conflict when it comes to carrying these identities as Black and Indigenous and a woman, identify as heterosexual also. So there's a lot of privilege in that. Earlier this summer, I do a lot of my work. I'm going to move into my advocacy space. At the coalition and in partnership with the Alliance, we co-wrote the legislation that acknowledged missing and murdered Indigenous people in the state of Idaho. And there was a supplemental legislative appropriation that allowed for $30,000 for us to research data and implications and missing gaps and understanding why there is no interagency collaboration around missing and murdered Indigenous people in Idaho. And I've actually had legislators to my face tell me in response to like when I started to move into the Black Lives organizing over the summer that I couldn't possibly do Black Lives organizing because I spent so much time repping Indigenous folks, right? Everything exists in a binary in colonizer spaces, right? It has to be yes or no, black or white, good or bad. There can't be multiple truths, and that is very difficult for them to understand. When I was really young in my identity development, my racial identity development, I came to this place, and this was before my grandmother died, my mother's mother, my katsat is how we say that in my language. And I was telling her what I was facing and feeling about being both Black and Indigenous. And at the end of the conversation was really simple. Like I'm sitting here crying in her arms at a sweat house. And she said, well, which grandmother would you deny? And that resonated with me. And even when I tell that story, it still tingles me like, which grandmother would I deny as part of my identity? And there's absolutely no way in my life would I ever deny the fact that I have this very powerful, strong, trailblazing Black grandmother and this incredible healer, matriarch, medicine woman on my Indigenous side. There's no way. And so it was at that point I was starting to move to a place that I can be both and that I am both, and that they exist, these identities exist, and I move through the world as both in a very powerful way. So if you have both identities and you are here this evening, I see you and I recognize the struggle, but also I hope that you see and feel your own power in being able to have both. Um, Here's a thread, like let's circle back then to the missing and murdered Indigenous people. Side note on that, I say people in Idaho, the majority of our missing folks here are actually Two-Spirit men. Men or boys. So I want to recognize that we focus on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and rightly so, 5,700 missing Indigenous women and girls across the country. In Idaho specifically, it's primarily Two-Spirit men. So that's something I just want to name. I also read an article from the Department of Justice recently that the sheer number of Black women who are also missing in the same capacity is very, very high. So there's a part of me, if I were less woke, I actually hate that word. We can talk about that in a minute. If I were less woke, I would be susceptible in any capacity. I couldn't go to the grocery store without having some level of terror. I couldn't go to these schools and teach. I couldn't move in the community without feeling like somebody is going to take me from my people, because that's the reality for both Black and Indigenous women. And this is a contemporary parallel, y'all. This isn't about our histories that are parallel. It is a contemporary parallel of white supremacy and colonization, where if you dismantle a community by violently accosting, assaulting, and abusing its women, then you can control and enslave those people. So I want us to really let that resonate. Also, what is that adage? I heard. I'm gonna not say this accurately, and I apologize for that. But a nation is not defeated until the hearts of its women are on the ground, right? And that's really, really powerful. 70% of the Indigenous nations in the United States are matriarchy, and rightly so. Our creation stories are built on women and creation and life-giving creatures, and rightly so. So it makes sense for a white supremacist, settler, colonial, Christian, patriarchal system to dismantle everything that is strong about its women to control that community and to control those people. And we still see this enacted today. So this is something we should also keep in mind. Let's talk about Black lives for a minute, and remembering the women. We didn't go nearly as hard for Breonna Taylor as we should have. We went really hard for George Floyd. It's okay for us to name that. It's okay for us to put that into the space. But Breonna Taylor is just as important. Sandra Bland, DeCynthia Clements, India Kager. I mean, the Say Her Name campaign, and repping for Black women, Black trans women and femmes is also incredibly powerful in any of this work that I do. And it's also a learning edge. What we're asking each other to do is to carry all of the identities all of the time. And that takes a lot of openness. It takes a lot of vulnerability. We constantly have to be working and open to feedback and open to call-ins, so that nobody is left out, right? So that's something that I'd also like to bring into this space, and be vulnerable about. It really is difficult to carry all of the things all of the time. And I'm thankful, and this is where one of the questions I'm gonna ask you as a prompt in a little bit is, think about who your people are, who is your community, and really lean into that now. Like relax into your body, drop your shoulders to your toes, and think about who are your people. And I don't want you to overthink it. I just want you to honor the story that arises. Whatever your knee jerk response would be, what is it? Who are those people? What community have you built for yourself? And I have an incredible community of very diverse, radical, damn near anarchist family members that I've chosen for myself, and I love it. It's damn the man, eat the rich, burn it down. I'm here for all of those things, and I don't think that I would eat hot food if somebody wasn't putting it in front of me in the midst of this work. I don't think that I would get sleep or be able to celebrate my wins if I didn't have people around me who loved me enough and who were invested in me enough to hold up a mirror or to grab my hand and make me pause. And that's really important. And I know I'm not the only Black woman. I'm not the only Indigenous woman who feels this. My mother had had COVID-19, and she runs the diabetes program for the tribal clinic on the Nez Perce Indian Reservation. So of course she got sick. Like the risk was really high. She was also doing triage as a nurse. And when she got sick, she was sick for 2 solid weeks. The day she tested negative, not that she felt better, not the day she felt better, the day she tested negative, she wanted to get back up and go to work. Damn near passes out at work. 3 days later has post-COVID pneumonia. And so was literally sick for about four weeks straight, and still had a level of guilt and shame for not being at work to take care of her people. And that broke my heart for her. That broke my heart for the fact that she would take care of her people at the expense of her own life. That is a really, really powerful characteristic of our communities, but also heartbreaking for these elders and these matriarchs who aren't taking care of themselves. And that's, I mean, and that's the reality. And I've absolutely adopted that same kind of behavior. So when we talk about who are your people and who is your community, think about who those people are that really encourage you to slow down and really encourage you to take care of yourself, because it's equally as important. I am nothing if not for my community. Let's see. I have so many stories I want to share with you, but I actually would like to take a pause here for a second and tell in the chat if there are some of you who want to share, the story of your community. Please do. Who is your community? Tell me the story of your people. And if any of my co-conspirators who invited me, Corinne, Juan, Tay, please jump in to share your story. Covert facets of white supremacy that we do is when we jump into a meeting, we just jump into the meeting. We skip the humanity. We skip the part where we need to connect with each other. We skip the part where we need to breathe, especially in like this time of Zoom, like in the time of Rona, where we just go from meeting to meeting to meeting. And I really love this prompt because it does force you to stop and not just recognize who your people are, but recognize like who you are to your people, right? Have you checked in on your folks? Have you checked in on your queer family? I am fortunate enough to have, it looks like 2 of my family on this call now, family that I chose, not family that I was born to. So thank you both for being here, Gabby and Dalton. Dalton is the one that feeds me. And then the other piece too that I also that I like to ask folks is, or no, it's in the same vein of tell me who your people are, right? I generally lead with the fact that I'm Black and Indigenous. I lead with the fact that I am a matriarch among several generations. I'm a baby matriarch among several generations of matriarchs. And when I've conducted these in story circles or asked these questions in story circles, white folks tend to dance around the fact that they're white people, which is really interesting to me and very fascinating. Like they don't want to lean into the fact that they have this ancestry, or they're trying to avoid these very difficult conversations around the fact that they are descendants of colonizers. So I try to drop colonizers as much as I can in the conversation to make them uncomfortable until they start talking about their whiteness. Like that's how we get to it, right? We got to have these hard conversations. We can't tell our stories until we are telling 1,000% raw stories. So if you are ever in a space where you get to facilitate a meeting, if you are ever in a space where you are even encouraging children to tell their stories, these answers, these replies are even better when the kids are between the ages of like 8 and 14. When you ask them, who are your people? Tell me the story of your land. Tell me the story of your water. And it's really, really fantastic. Awesome. Dalton, thank you for coming on camera. Will you please share the stories now? And I paid a lot of money for it. I didn't love my college experience, so I don't ever lead with that. But it just is telling that I have a very wide framework for viewing the world, and part of that framework includes academia and how shitty it was for me. Storytelling for me is definitely about making our old ways new, right? Finding the intersections of innovation and tradition. What does that look like for us? And how can we use those intersections to imagine an incredible, thriving and vibrant world for our future generations? Superman, the Cree, I think he's Cree. Yes, he's Cree or Crow. Crow, he's Crow. The Crow fancy dancer. He's a motivational speaker and he travels across the country telling his story. But one of the quotes that I love from him is like, what we now consider traditional was once brand new. What we now consider traditional was once brand new. And I would really love for us to let that resonate for a moment, especially those of us who carry cultural knowledge, right? I'm new to my language. I'm new to some of these. I didn't grow up on the res. I have to constantly engage with my elders and my matriarchs to keep these cultural practices going. Of all of the, like, I think I have 12 total aunties that I circle around to every time I go home as much as I can. Only one of them acts as a gatekeeper. Only one of them shames me because I'm not saying the words right. Only one of them is always yelling at me for something because it's not traditional. I'm half Black and half Indigenous. I am the very opposite of traditional, right? So when I talk about my existence as an act of political defiance, that's just not in white spaces. That is also in Native American spaces as well. To be Black and to be Indigenous is really difficult in Indigenous spaces because anti-Blackness is real. Also let that resonate. Among the difficulties of my experiences as a storyteller, as a Black and Indigenous woman, is the fact that I have to justify and lean into my Blackness in a community that is hostile to Black people. So that's something that Indigenous folks have to really look inward to, and as a community heal from, which I think is why these storytelling spaces are really important. So if you are Black and you are Indigenous, I see you. Or if you identify as Afro-Indigenous, if you identify as Afro-Latino, which also has some identity spaces to it that is Indigenous, if you are a Black Indian, so the descendant of slaves and Cherokee Nation, like those are important distinctions to make, but important stories that you have to tell. And I see you. The anti-Blackness from your people is so real. And it's, I think it's part of it's one of the most heartbreaking facets of these identities of having to navigate that space. And it comes from some folks who are the closest to us, like this auntie who once was my favorite auntie, but consistently yells at me for no reason because her attachment to what is traditional doesn't have any room for fluidity. It doesn't have any room for change. And what's interesting to me about that is in our communities, we're often taught about how powerful water is. We are taught, be like the water. Leave your prayers and your worries with the water. Leave your sadness with the water. If you have something to celebrate, go to the water and celebrate it. The water, be like the water. And for us to have these very rigid attachments to tradition, when those things, those practices were once brand new in the community, means that we really are losing we're creating too much space between ourselves and the water. And I want each and every one of you, now here's a second prompt for you to think about. Tell me about a body of water that empowers you. Tell me about a body of water that centers you. Tell me about a body of water that feels like home. And I'll go ahead and model that for you. So I am from the Nimipu Reservation, and there is an area on the reservation called Tiwapu. That is where there is a curve in the river, the Kuskia River, the Clearwater River in Idaho, near Orfino, Idaho. And I spent every lunch break for damn near 2 years praying there, laughing there, crying there, walking my dog, enjoying the seasons, I could tell you what it sounds like and what it smells like and what it feels like. But on those moments, in those moments of my deepest despair, when I sat by that river and cried and prayed, I could feel that I wasn't alone. It didn't sound like I was alone. It didn't feel like I was alone. The cold couldn't touch me because I was literally sitting by the water where my people have sat for hundreds or for tens of thousands of years. I have people that were buried there. There were artifacts in the ground. Those rocks have been touched by me and 7 generations before me. And that feeling of comfort and that space is really, really powerful. And then there's another place of the river by Hell's Canyon. Many of you may know it. It's deeper than the Grand Canyon, but Hell's Canyon is on the ancestral territory of the Nimipu people also. And in that space also is where our prayers are the deepest and the strongest. And it's really powerful to sit in those spaces. So I wish that for everybody. I realized in in my speaking engagements and my travels throughout the world, not everybody has a body of water that feels like home. Not everybody has a body of water where they can leave their prayers. Not everybody has a body of water that centers and grounds them. And I wish that for all of you. And it doesn't, and that's not even to say like, oh, this river belongs to my people and nobody can go to this river. No, this is a beautiful river. Everybody should be able to touch water and feel this kind of connection. And if we don't, reflect on that for yourself. If you don't reflect on that, where is the river located? Is the river dirty? Like, I don't get into the Boise River because it's gross to me and I feel like it will drown me. And that's just the whole like indigenous vibe. Like, I can't get in this river. She'll try to eat me. So I don't act like everybody floats that river every summer and I literally will not get into that river. She will drown me. So I don't. I just say hi and I keep walking. And but the Miwa people and the Numu people have all kinds of creation stories with that river, and those are to be respected and honored. I grew up in well, I guess I spent a great deal of time in Southeast Asia. I lived in Singapore for a long time, which was its own interesting experience. For those of you who are from tropical spaces, you know how magical that is. Like, my skin was fantastic. My hair was just perfect and it was glorious and I just glowed all the time. And I loved the ocean. Like, just being in the ocean was this also empowering experience. And to bring this all full circle for you is the same way that water moves in full circle, right? Last year, I had the opportunity to see the Atlantic Ocean for the first time. And then I went to Hawaii a few months later and then got to hang out in the Pacific Ocean, you know. And what's really grounding and sobering about that is that Indigenous people feel like water has touched everything and everybody. It's the thing that connects me to all of you, the water that has touched you and rained on you, that is in your ice cubes in your cocktail. All of that water has touched every other piece of humanity. And that is the most connecting piece of water that we can possibly lean on. And I really love that. So the fact that I got to lay in the Atlantic Ocean and lay in the Pacific Ocean and then sit by my river was just this really incredible feeling for me. And I reflect on that and what that felt like all the time. Water is everywhere. It's inside of us. It's around us. It's on top of us. So it makes sense for us to move through the world like water, without rigidity, without fear. If there are rocks in the water moves around it. If the riverway gets thin, we just barrel through it like white water. When it's wide, we move slow and take our time. When it's cold, we freeze. When it's hot, we evaporate, and then we rain back down on the people. And I love that. That means that as humans, our behavior can model water in 1,000 different ways, and we can connect in 1,000 different ways. And that is actually why healing is so important. And that's actually the connecting piece of healing for all of us. I hope that makes sense to you. So I'm going to reiterate that, that prompt. Tell me about a body of water that grounds you, that centers you, that feels like home, or the water of your people. So let that marinate for a second. If there are any of you who'd like to share your body of water, please feel free. Like ocean better too. And while I was in Hawaii, a dear relative of mine who hosted us, she's been in Hawaii her whole life. and talked about how powerful it was to surrender to water, right? Water is strong enough to give life, but powerful enough to take it. And that, like that, being able to surrender to something like that is really a test of trust and again of vulnerability. Water is also the thing that heals us. So I love that you feel your best self by water. That's really one of the takeaways. I also think, and now actually this is like a real time thought, like if I need to connect with somebody to go take a walk by water, and I actually haven't ever done that, but at sweat houses we do. Our sweat houses are always built by creeks, right? Like of course they're built by a creek because of course it's water. And of course that's what, that's part of the ceremonial practice. I heard a story once from an elder here. He is of the Niwa people. And when he was a little boy, um, outside of sweat, he thought he was going to help his grandma. It was in the middle of the winter, and during the sweat, they go in and it's hot, and they come out and they rinse off with the creek water. And so at that time, he thought as a little boy, like, oh, I'm going to help my grandma out, and I'm going to warm this water up for my gram. So he warms up the water in the pot, and she comes out of the sweat house and she rinses off. It gave her pause for a moment, but then she just kept rinsing off and finished the ceremony and finished sweat, and they went home. And at home, he asked his grandma, well, were you not happy that I did that for you? And she told him, it's not our place to change how nature gives herself to us, right? It is not for us to change the way water moves. It is not for us to change nature for our own comfort. We are of nature. We do not control her. And that was a really powerful story for me because he is now an elder sharing this wisdom that it is not for us to try to control, manipulate, or subdue nature in any way, shape, or form. Bring down the dams. This is my shameless plug for breaching all of the dams on the Snake River and the Columbia rivers. I would really love to see our salmon runs come back to full fruition and health. But that's something that we should also keep in mind too as we move through the world. What is our relationship to the water? What is our relationship to nature? And is it a relationship of control and abuse and extraction, or is it a relationship of balance and of mutual giving and of reverence? Like those are things that we also need to be mindful of in our relationship to water. So I'm gonna like move us and shift directions a little bit, but I'm gonna recap some of the things that I talked about. Storytelling is a spiritual practice and a cultural practice, but everybody is capable of sharing their stories. I want you to understand that storytelling is an old way that we've now made new. And I think it's the most direct way for us to connect to one another. Storytelling is also an act of decolonization for some of the reasons that I've talked about, right? It's a relationship to nature. And in that, let me identify the fact that Black folks built this country on stolen land from Indigenous people. Again, a common thread between our communities. Black folks were forced displaced from their homes as well when the slave trade started. Black folks, previously Africans, were indigenous to their homeland from where they were stolen. So that's an important, like Black descendants of slaves have indigeneity somewhere in the world. And at the same time had to witness Indigenous folks being robbed violently of their land. And this is a collective trauma that's shared across these identities. And I really wish was something that we studied and discussed more. Healing can begin when we turn into the pain. Healing begins when we have honest conversations about our ailments. I have to have this conversation with white folks a lot when I'm doing anti-racism education because their first knee jerk is like, let's stop talking about race, and it goes away. Anytime our body is sick, we don't stop talking about the sickness and hope that it goes away. We have to talk about what's happening and then treat the pain and treat the symptoms and identify the problem. And that's what discussions around race need to be in our country now. Let's talk about this very ugly history that is permeating all of the systems that govern us, and then decolonize them, dismantle them, break them down so we can get to a place of balance and protecting the sacred and keeping nature healthy and being in a strong relationship with one another where there is equity and there is justice and there is love. So storytelling also plays a big part in that work and in that piece as well. I want to make some time a little bit. So we're about good time. I want to be able to ask a couple of questions in just a moment, but now I'm kind of gonna like just freelance this next piece. I had I had planned and written this really, I don't know, lovely anecdote of the last couple of months of my life. But these stories that I want to share with you now will be brief and are vulnerable. So I'm going to give you a couple of content warnings. They are discussions of assault and abuse and murder. So if you feel like you need to mute me for a while, I recognize that and I honor that. Please honor your own human needs. Please take a bio break as you need to. I will not take offense. I also recognize that each of us can only engage with what we're capable of. So make sure that your cup is filled up, right? Anyway, so I had planned this whole speech and I realized today, like I was struggling moving into this evening. With all of these words like written on a page and they just didn't feel right. My intuition was telling me that this wasn't what I needed to give you all this evening. I learned recently from a spiritual teacher advisor of mine that our intuition is actually our ancestors trying to speak to us. Gut feelings are ancestors trying to tell us if something is good for who we are and who we need to be. So leaning into intuition is something I'm really trying to do. So while normally you would get this very polished, gorgeous Tai Simpson storyteller presentation, you're not going to get that. In October, the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence hosted a virtual conference on missing and murdered Indigenous people. And it was well attended. It was in depth. It had a lot of breadth. We had a lot of diversity of presenters. It was well received. The feedback is magical. It was the first of its kind. We didn't know what we were doing because we were doing the whole thing online. How do we keep folks engaged? How do we keep folks interested? And it went well. And I am deeply thankful that the community could leave that space with tools they could use actively to dismantle violence in Native American communities. The audience of the conference were federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They were advocates, they were policymakers, they were educators, they were teachers, so many different backgrounds that participated. The conference ended on Thursday, October 29th. On Saturday, October 31st, I got a phone call that my cousin, she's 28 years old, was murdered by her partner. We have since found out that she was strangled by him. And this is in the Nez Perce community. The immediate waves of guilt and of shame that comes with doing anti-violence work, only to end a conference 2 days later finding out that the very thing we're trying to prevent happened. And what that means for our people, and how do we navigate that in a way that is decolonized, that honors who we are in our old way, but also gives us something to think about for the generations to come. The families offered this unique hybrid service for this young person. In my culture, we don't say their name, so I just want to offer that. And I'm respectfully offering this story outside of what would be our normal cultural practices of not talking about it for a year, but I think it's relevant to storytelling and to healing. Following the traditional services, the next morning, they opened the casket. Hundreds of members of the community were able to see bruises and cuts and markings. And my immediate reaction to it was rage and pain and hurt and fear, because I'm also a survivor of domestic violence. The dreams that I've been having since then are replaying that funeral, but it's not her in the casket, it's me. It's not her in the casket, it's my nieces. It's not her in the casket, it's my mother. And to carry this kind of pain and rage and hurt doesn't, it's not who I want to be, and it's not who I want to move through the world as. But I think it's important to this discussion because now the next steps are, well, what can I do with the energy? Where does it go? What do we do? And so last week I called the assailant's family. What do his parents need? What does he need? Victim service provision just isn't about her who lost her life. It's about the whole community. The whole community is feeling the loss. The whole community is feeling despair and rage. And in our old way, made new, how do we take care of each other through the collective harm? How do we collectively heal and move through this? How do we have honest conversations about why addiction and joblessness and trauma affect us this way? Trauma begets trauma. Violence is a symptom of pain, and pain is a symptom of trauma. Violence begets violence. It's all a cycle for us, and it's all this very like heavy thing that we each carry. So how do we break it? How do we actively break that cycle of pain? There's still a lot of unanswered questions as we are 3 weeks away from her passing, from her journey. There's still a lot of questions of what we do now. But this is the first time in a long time where the community doesn't want punitive justice. We don't want the FBI. We don't want cops. We don't want prisons. What we want is healing. How do we heal the families? How do we make sure his son doesn't behave this way? And I'm here for that. And that comes from telling stories, sharing the most difficult stories, and coming to a place where we interrupt the cycle of trauma, where we address and heal the pain. And when we do that for ourselves on an individual level, right? When we do that, when we name our needs, when we state our needs, when we share our own stories of violence and abuse, we remove the shame for ourselves, and then we remove the shame for others to tell their stories as well. I am a survivor of domestic violence. My perpetrator is still at large, and I every day for about a minute feel terrified that he'll just show up someday. I am a survivor of sexual violence as a teenager and had an abortion as a result of that violence. Every day I think about that and who that baby is in the next world. I can't have children, but my brother had my children for me, which I'm forever grateful. I'm an auntie, and I'm that auntie. I spoil them rotten and then give them back. All of this to say, and all of this to bring full circle. Storytelling is not only a recognition of ancestry and a telling of who we are now, but it is also writing a story for our future. And this is what makes futurism hard. These moments, that day that we all saw her in that casket, make writing a story for the future difficult, insurmountably, like unthinkable, like it's not something that we could ever imagine. And yet we can. Collectively, we are capable of seeing and honoring the humanity of each other, seeing and honoring the parallel history between us, seeing and honoring the love in each of us, seeing and honoring the water, because it's the water that also connects us, and then writing a story collectively for the future thereafter. That's my big vision. Anyway, I'm a radical, I'm a revolutionary, I'm an anarchist, I'm a decolonizer. I'm a big lover, I'm a laugher, I'm a storyteller. And I hope that you all from today think about the story of your people, the body of water that you call home, the way that you're connected to your community, and can use that in multiple identities to inspire others for a better future. Because now that we've all spent this time together, we're all now writing a story for the future together. And that's part of my big vision and my big hope. So Hamak is Katsiao. That's what I have for you as far as storytelling goes. And I welcome and invite all of your questions that you have. This is who I am as a storyteller, always giving. So it's not just me storytelling, it's also tools. So I will copy and paste those into the chat for you, and I'll talk about those and then answer the question. For accessibility, the questions read, who are you committed to? What do you intend to commit to? What is your life dedicated to? How do you become what your next generation needs? How do you become what your descendants need? And who are you called to be in this moment? And so those collective questions, right, don't overthink them, right? And they can change. The water changes every day. You are allowed to change every day. Your answers to these questions can change every single day. You don't have to be the same person today that you are tomorrow. Like, I always love to post that meme and repost that meme that's like, read books, be a freak, twerk, like go to church. Like, you can do all of the things, and I do, right? Drink wine, drink water. I think that that's important for us to all recognize. And I love these set of questions specifically because they can change. And the first two questions, what are you committed to? And what do you intend to commit to? And I'm going to go ahead and answer your question. Andrew's question says, I'm curious about what keeps you inspired and motivated to share your story, especially when things are difficult. I gave a presentation a few weeks ago about environmental justice and decolonizing social justice work. And this question also came up. In our world, in our contemporary times, we watch all of these movies, World War Z, Book of Eli, I Legend, or I Am Legend, something along those lines. And all of them are these like catastrophic, dystopian futures. So really think about those movies and what you remembered from those movies. Now think about the times that we're living in right now. Our ancestors, this is their dystopia. We are living in a world that our ancestors prayed against. We are living in a world that our ancestors couldn't have possibly imagined. And that motivates me to do something different, to be better. We use plastics way too much. We over extract from the planet. There is resource hoarding. Capitalism is literally the commodification of humanity. Like, we have a lot of work to dismantle and a lot of systems to break down because it's disrespectful to the planet. It's disrespectful to our ancestors. And so that is a very clear lens for me, that I am living in my ancestors' dystopia. So I have to do better and be better, because I'll be damned if I leave this for my future generations. The Nez Perce War was lost in 1870, if I'm not mistaken. And it was cold, and it was a few miles south of the Canadian border, and it's where Chief Joseph gave his surrender speech. And I can only imagine what they were praying for in that moment, who they were praying for in that moment, through all of the rape and the displacement and the violence and the cutting of their hair and the theft of their children to boarding schools and the forced sterilization and the lack of access to voting and the lack of access to food. And we couldn't move and migrate with our seasons and animals. We couldn't harvest our foods. Through all of those prayers and all of those ceremonies, we are who is alive now. We are the ones who are supposed to make the world better because we were prayed and loved into existence. And if I'm going to be the best woman I can, if I'm going to be the best storyteller I can be, I set a better example for my nieces. And I do the most that I can to make the river easier down the road. Like, I make it that the river that my descendants get to stand in isn't a river that's polluted, isn't a river that's hard to access, that there's actually still a river, right? Like, these are all things that really keep me motivated. And I'll tell you this, the difficulty isn't in doing the work. It isn't in the storytelling. The difficulty is in doing this work for people and a place and a planet that I will never see in my lifetime. I have to imagine this. I have to do this work for something that I have envisioned and imagined, and then commit my whole life to that dream. And that's the difficult work, because every day I have to wake up and do it. But I remember I was prayed and loved into existence through slavery. I was prayed for through Indigenous displacement. I was prayed for through forced displacement, through rape. I was prayed for. And here I am. And now I'm praying for a much better world and working for a much better world that I will never see. And that I have to let that be enough. So I hope that you I hope that that answers the question, and I hope that these questions that I posted for you in the chat can give you like, it can kind of jar your own motivation, can kind of jar your own purpose. And I'm not saying that I don't take breaks, y'all. Like, I don't do this work all the time. Like, I watch Gossip Girl, like binge it, and that's ridiculous, like mindless television. I drink a lot of wine. Like, I eat chocolate chip cookies. Like, it's not like I'm this perfect human by any stretch. I do believe in like holistic wellness though too, right? So get sleep, get rest, drink water. I'm a boxer. So outside of like doing all the social justice things, I box. And that is actually very helpful. It's a very healing space for me. That's where I was able to come home to my body after violence and abuse. So boxing really helped that out for me. And I attribute that to my boxing coach, who is also one of my very best friends, who holds space for me in an emotional way and also for my physical wellness. So there's a couple of different things that I do to be able to keep this going from a practical place. But really all of this is very metaphysical, very metaphorical in some degree, but I have to believe in the way that my ancestors believed that things could be better and will be better. So that's my answer to that. So thank you for asking that question. I did get another question privately. Do I have any advice for prospective grad students who were asked to share their story in a short number of words on their applications? Word limits feel inherently anti-Indigenous in academic spaces, and how do we cope with that? Yo. Whew. First of all, y'all shouldn't be paying for school. That's what I believe. People talk about decolonization and what that looks like. If you are going to college on any, like, first of all, it's all Indian land. If you are going to school on your own Indigenous homeland, it should be free. So I'm going to say that. That's an aside, not actually answer to the question. And it is anti-Indigenous to limit stories. It is anti-Indigenous to tell us how much space we have to express who we are. One of the things that I noticed about those applications, right, is they will tell me who you are. White folks will generally answer that question about what they do, not who they are. I got this on my ACT. I got this. I did this club. I participated. I was a president of this thing, that thing. You tell me, you read off your resume to me rather than telling me who you are. And I think that in Indigenousness, right, you heard me talk about how I am Tai Simpson after I am Beck's daughter and Lucille's granddaughter, and then the great 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 granddaughter of Atitwatit, and then the great 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 granddaughter of Tamina Ilp Ilp, right? So I am of my ancestors before I'm anything else on paper, and that is very difficult. How do you cope with that? Yeah, I don't have an easy answer. Like I said, college was miserable for me. Anytime I have any kind of writing assignment, I like tax over it for weeks because I have a really bad writing anxiety. But I will suggest this. And this actually helps me when I do have limits on things, because college is not built for Indigenous folks to succeed. College was not built for Black folks to succeed and participate. It was not built for us to have participatory roles and leadership. But here's how I managed to get through. If I were to die today, what do I want folks to remember about me? And generally it's 1 or 2 sentences, 1, 2, maybe 3 sentences. If I were to die, if I were to journey today, creator forbid, I've lived a really great life and I've done really great work, number 1 and 2, but what do I want my people to remember about me? What do I want those people to remember about me in that particular capacity? And generally that isolates it down to the word limit. It's very frustrating because we are not only what we put on paper, we are our ancestors, we are descendants, we are our water, we are our land and our language and our hair and our bodies. We are all of these things, and they want it in 300 words or less, which is why I don't tweet, y'all. I don't have a Twitter because 160 characters is literally not enough. Literally not enough for me to rant. So I hope that that gives you some guidance on how to navigate that space. And, you know, I'm sorry that university is a trap in some degree. It's not meant to expand who you are as a person. It's limiting who you are in that academic space. Academia's got a lot of work to do, y'all. A lot of work. So those were the questions that came through. I don't see any more coming in. How are y'all feeling?
First of all, I'm just so grateful that you've shared your space, your craft, your knowledge with us tonight. And I'm especially ecstatic and happy that you honored yourself in terms of, you know, kind of digressing from this polished speech thing that you had going on, and then you just kind of trusted your intuition and you trusted your ancestors and you followed that route. And I am incredibly just moved by that. And I mean, I was honestly like brought to tears even now, just in everything you shared. So thank you, Yehan, so much for everything.
Thank you for that. I do. Yeah, that's my words of wisdom. Honor your intuition, y'all. Honor what your intuition is, your ancestors trying to let you know what's good. So do the thing. Do what your ancestors want you to do. There was another thing too. I always want to do this. Like just shout out folks. So my earrings are from Native Anthro. They're on Instagram. We're moving into the holiday season. So if you're giving gifts, please purchase Indigenous artists, not Indigenous inspired, because don't buy Native American things at Urban Outfitters. That's appropriation. And then my background, because I don't want you all to see my messy apartment, is art by Stephen Paul Judd, who is incredible. Please give him a Google. I know somebody said my background is awesome. I know this has an entitlement or has a title. I just can't remember what the title is, but if you can kind of see it, it's like teepees and Godzilla and UFOs. And I love all of that. It's like my fave. These UFOs are modeled after The Day the Earth Stood Still from the 1954 version, which is the best version, by the way. So those were a couple of things that I wanted to name, and then offer deep gratitude to my community, who, like my personal community, who showed up to be a part of this for me. It's always nice to know that my family holds space, even when I don't realize that they're holding space till later. So thank you so much for that. And a couple of other things, and this is going to be me yelling at myself more than telling you, our celebrating our joy is as equally important to the revolution as is addressing the problem. Do the things that bring you joy, do the things that bring you love, buy the thing, read the book, drink the drink, buy the puppy, I just bought a truck a while back, buy the truck, like do whatever, do the things that your joy is part of this revolution, y'all, joy and love. And your wellness is also part of the revolution. Take care of your heart, take care of your body, take care of your mental wellness as well. Like take care of that is part of the revolution. Our individual self-care is as important to this revolution and to this big future that we're envisioning, as is the hard work of anti-racism education and going to college and, raising our families. Taking care of ourselves is not selfish. It is selfless for generations to come. So those are kind of my high points, and I would really love for you to take those things away as well. But that's all I've got, y'all. Yo, kalo, katsia, yeah.
Thank you again so much. And I think Tay is gonna, it's been hard juggling the two Tays and Ties. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Tays and Ties. Thank you all again so much for coming, and thank you, Tai, for sharing this space with us. Everything that you said, I was feeling so deeply. This conversation about centering joy is actually something that keeps coming up, specifically within our center, and then today as well. We had our Trans Day of Remembrance Vigil and Community Space earlier, and we're really talking about how the day is about remembering those that were taken away from us, but also celebrating their lives and celebrating the lives of those that are still with us, continuing to share their legacies, bringing that with us on our own journeys. So I'm really feeling that a lot today. So thank you. I also wanted to share, I know Corinne shared some things coming up for the ITRC. The Black Resource Center also has things going on. We have some of our regular programs, such as a family room, which is just a space that's open for folks to come by, hang out, talk. If you want to play games, do that. We have Black Friday every odd Friday. So it's conversations that intertwine with Blackness, or how Black folks experience different things, different topics every other week. And then also we have different groups. So a Black, queer, and trans group called Blackout Space. Aside of that, I lead a trans non-binary space as well through the LGBT Resource Center. And then in December, we're having a paint and wine tonight. So wine like the dance, not like the drink. But look out for that. So you can sign up, and we'll be actually sending out materials so folks can participate in that. But again, thank you so much for coming out today. And I love sharing space with everyone, hearing everything that folks were sharing, reading the things in the chat. it was really great to form our own little community tonight.
And with that, I'm going to close us out. So I dropped in the chat the websites for both the BRC, the ITRC, and Ethnic Studies. Ethnic Studies was also a sponsor for tonight's event. And then Tai has also dropped in her social media and websites as well. But thank you again. I hope you all have a good weekend. And I appreciate you all being here today to hear these stories.